Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Joe Phillips. Joe is an associate professor at Busan National University, as well as the director of the Human Rights Center there, and he is also a research fellow at Yonsei Human Liberty Center. And while a lot of his research have focused around the intersection of international relations, law, corporate and social responsibility, and human rights, recently some of that research has been channeled into an ongoing project around the study of lesbian, gay, bi, trans and queer rights, or as it will be referred to in this podcast, LGBTQ rights, in South Korea. Now from the outside, the landscape here looks like one of intolerance. Across a series of different measurements of how you rate LGBTQ rights, South Korea always comes in quite low, always performing poorly internationally. And yet there's a dichotomy here. In many ways it is a country of intolerance, a country of indifference, and yet there is also a vibrant LGBTQ scene in this regard, of expanding spaces, increased visibility, and even growing protections. As we look at this, we're going to go across the gambit of Korean law, what it does and doesn't mention about these rights, the impact this has for people's freedoms, and their protection against discrimination. We'll have a look at the Constitution and a series of different legal cases that have come up over the years that have been fought in open court or ruled upon by the South Korean Human Rights Commission. And of course, beyond this, there's a political dimension to speak about. There is no major party inside South Korea that supports the increase in these rights. Current President Moon Jae-in, firmly from the left side of Korean politics, has publicly stated that he does not support gay marriage or even legislation that would prohibit hate speech and other similar crimes. And yet socially things are shifting. Increasingly there's representation of the LGBTQ community in K-pop, in movies, in TV, and as you might expect, shifting demographics that show a much greater tolerance and acceptance in the younger community than that of the old. And yet for all this progress, this landscape doesn't seem to be shifting too much. And perhaps some of this has to do with the response and the collective organization of evangelical groups. These groups over the years have challenged legal decisions, pressured political leaders to change legislation, or at least policy platforms, and wherever possible have counter-protested against LGBTQ marches and festivals. Evangelicals in South Korea are only 18% of the population, but in this regard, they're having a significantly outsized voice and drawing clear battle lines across social change inside their country. Digging deeper into the social challenges facing this community, we will look at transgender rights and South Korea's military code, which prohibits all same-sex acts on penalty of imprisonment and dishonorable discharge. This in a country that makes it mandatory for all males to join the military. At first glance, a lot of this seems quite repressive and unreformed, especially when you look at cases where students have been expelled or punished at Christian universities for daring to advocate for LGBTQ rights, even in the most minor of ways. And yet through their legal battles, through their pushback, through their protest, there seems to be a groundswell of change, small signs of which are certain pastors in certain congregations in Seoul openly accepting the LGBTQ community into their churches, or simply the continuity and growing size of the pro-LGBTQ rights movement across Korea. Now there is so much to talk about in this podcast. Questions of politics, social change, legality, constitutional interpretation, deep moral questions about what a society should look like, and the practical application of those morals, how activist groups should go about changing society, what they should pursue and what they should not, in the hopes of bringing along as many people with them for this change, and for the human rights standard that they're hoping to achieve in the long run. But from here on out, I'm going to let Joe explain this. And as I tend to do, I'm going to link below this podcast a series of Joe's articles. They all come at the issue from different directions, and they weave together to build up a fascinating picture of just what is happening in South Korea when it comes to LGBTQ rights, the issues facing this community, the challenges they have to elicit change, and the prospects of achieving this into the future. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on this podcast across social media. And of course, if you have any recommendations for future guests, feel free to include those as well. On that, and to talk us through the question of LGBTQ rights in South Korea, this is Joe Phillips. Joe Phillips, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
I'm very happy to join you.
Now, I don't always do this, but you do have an incredibly rich and vibrant array of research out there, and it's in touches on so many areas. And just on this particular topic today, there is so much detail here. So I might get you as a first question here, just to introduce your research here, and that might give us a good direction for how where this interview is going to go.
Okay. I'm interested in human rights. That's been the focus of my research for the last several years, and I also predominantly teach in courses that either directly relate to human rights or touch on human rights. So I have looked at issues regarding the integration of acceptance of migrants, foreigners into Korea, and also most recently, my research has focused on the relationship between proponents and opponents of LGBTQ rights in Korea. So I've done empirical work in that field and theoretical work in that field. I primarily focus on Korea because, well, not just because I'm here, but because it's a very dynamic area for LGBTQ rights, having both characteristics of Western liberal democracy, but at the same time, very relatively conservative, Confucian, and unusual for East Asia, Christian elements as well. And so there is a lot of push and pull going on in Korea right now. It's also an area that is woefully understudied in Western literature, as you might expect, which tends to focus more on Western movements. So that's more or less what my research has been focusing on recently.
So from that, let's pad out the LGBTQ issue and South Korea itself. Now, through a lot of your research, of course, there's going to have a very similar starting point, and that is the idea, or at least the feeling inside South Korea today, that this is a fairly intolerant society towards these particular branch of human rights. So what does the landscape look like today? Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of empirical research here, and you've got data from the OECD and the Rainbow Index, and South Korea always seems to be performing incredibly poorly on these metrics.
Right. It does, because those metrics tend to look at sort of in-state or in-result metrics like, is same-sex marriage legal? Are civil unions allowed? Is same-sex adoption allowed? Specific anti-discrimination legislation. And Korea does fare very poorly across all those measures in terms of in-state legislative or court victories. So there have been some in the area of transgenders, but if we look below that superficial characteristic, and we look at what's going on, we could say in the society and at the grassroots level in terms of activism, there is a vibrant LGBTQ community. Certainly in the major cities in Korea. I've looked at Seoul and to a great extent Busan, and we see a lot of LGBT organizations at universities, outside of universities, large LGBTQ presence at events, most particularly, of course, the Seoul Queer Festival. Last year, 80,000 people attended, with dozens of booths being from various groups being represented. There is also a vibrant social community here. A lot of it is online, but that's of course true today for most socialization. But there are pockets within cities like Busan and of course in Seoul where LGBT are openly expressing themselves in clubs and in bars and an environment for dating and meeting. So it is a very, it's not simple. One could describe it as as a kind of a I don't want to use the term Jekyll and Hyde, but kind of a Janus-faced situation. And it kind of depends on what part of the face you look at in evaluating just how strong the community is here and the advancements they've been able to make.
So we'll dig into that dichotomy because that is one of the really fascinating things about this, that sort of that two-faced kind of idea that there's a deeply conservative, intolerant society and yet a vibrant gay and lesbian community and on the other side of this.
But, let me just make, if I can interrupt you, one other additional point, which I think is very important, and that is the generational divide. So if you look at polling, yes, Koreans 50s and older are express quite conservative views on things like same-sex marriage and LGBTQ. When you shift to people in their 20s, the percentage of approval of same-sex marriage, which can be, let's say, as a measurement for tolerance, is essentially the same as what we find in the United States.
So there's a generational change that's, I suppose, coming forth at some point in this.
One could predict that. One could predict that, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So let's move on, as of course this issue is going to build and build and build throughout this interview here, so we're not going to leave it behind. But what does the Korean political and I suppose let's start on the legal landscape look like here? Is just what restrictions are there? Because it's my understanding, and of course this is a layman's understanding here, that homosexuality and transgender rights and lesbian rights, etc., are not criminalized inside the country, but there is a whole level of legal restrictions on other aspects, like gay marriage, for example.
Yes, you stated it correctly. Homosexual activity is not illegal, except in the military. So it is illegal to have homosexual sex. If you're a member of the South Korean military, and that includes whether you're having it on or off military bases while you're actually in service, or whether you're on leave, and people have been prosecuted for that. But outside of that, we don't see the criminalization that we did in the West, which LGBTQ activists had to initially overcome. It took them many years to overcome in the United States, just getting their activities, their sexual activities particularly, not criminalized. So in that sense, we can see a certain amount, I suppose you could say, tolerance in Korea. But as you also point out, the rights end of the spectrum is also not present. So there isn't a right to same-sex marriage or civil unions or adoption. There are no enforceable protections against discrimination in the workplace or housing. There are various rulings by the National Human Rights Commission of Korea, which has been fairly liberal, progressive in promoting the idea of non-discrimination, but its rulings are advisory. They are not are declarative. They're not enforceable. And we've seen various cities in Korea put provisions in their city codes prohibiting discrimination, including discrimination against people because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, but again, not legally enforceable. So, this kind of an absence in many ways of law on either the more restrictive end or the positive end.
How do you see that absence? Is it because for many people listening, they'll think if it's such a restrictive society, why wouldn't they have this layering of laws? So it sounds almost like an indifference of sorts, as in the law is just not there, and it's not an issue in people's minds for a long time, and therefore they've been allowed to forget about it, and therefore law has perhaps not caught up with them. Or how do you see this absence of legal restrictions, and also, I suppose, on the other side, legal protections?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and to some extent, it's a bit outside of my expertise. Part of the answer would lie in Korean history, and whether this sort of activity has been tolerated, and by this sort of activity I mean LGBTQ sexual activity has been tolerated in Korea's past, or more acceptable in Korea's past, which didn't have the more puritanical Western Christian doctrines, which led to a lot of laws against the behavior in the West. That's possible, though I think that's quite contested by people as to whether, of course it went on, but, was it accepted? Was it just tolerated? But from a political science perspective, the reason I see an absence of laws making LGBTQ sexual activity illegal is because it has been so suppressed, because it has not been out in the open until recently. So there simply was no imperative, no need seen to make it illegal.
There's a constitutional question that I suppose you touched on ever so slightly in your previous answer, and that was this idea that there's been a number of rulings by the Human Rights Commission that have, of course, non-binding, but are rulings themselves. And that begs the question, so if there are rulings from this Human Rights Commission that are, I suppose, push back on things like workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation, for example, I'm assuming that the basis for this has to be in some way constitutional. Is this referred back to the Korean Constitution in any way, or is this simply a ad hoc human rights organization?
Sometimes they do reference the Constitution. Sometimes they do reference constitutional court decisions. But I would say predominantly their views are expressed in terms of normatively, this is what should be the case, right? We should not be discriminating against people on this basis. Because, of course, even if the Constitution didn't speak to this, then legislation is still possible, right? You don't have to have it rooted in the Constitution.
And there's a question here. We mentioned already that gay marriage is illegal in South Korea, but it is also the case that civil unions are illegal here too. And there's this fascinating case of the film director who films the first same-sex wedding in 2013, and of course bumps into all sorts of challenges as a result of that, and pushbacks from court. So I might get to introduce that case and as a good, I suppose, way to open up the scene for us.
Jo Kwang-soo Kim, a film director, married his partner, Sung-hwan Kim, in 2013. Now, this was the first that we're aware of public same-sex wedding ceremony in Korea. It was not legalized. When they attempted to get a marriage certificate, they were refused, and so they filed a claim in a Seoul district court. And in 2016, the district court denied their petition, referencing the Korean Constitution, and the court concluded that under their interpretation of the Constitution, marriage is limited to a union between a man and a woman. And they built on Korea's traditional view of marriage and the public's general understanding of what marriage is, because the Constitution is not, as many constitutions are, as you know, not that specific. So they have to interpret the language, and they relied on tradition and general understanding. The Kims then filed an appeal to Korea's constitutional court, but that court has discretion in whether it wants to take an appeal, and it never took up their appeal, so it was left with the Seoul Western District Court's decision.
So there are other elements in this as well. Some other, I mean, there's a challenge there, and this is the idea that this is gay rights and in that particular instance, pushing itself to the fore in many ways and becoming much more visible. But of course, bumping up against deeper and deeper conservatism inside the country, and a pushback, not just a legal pushback, but also a pushback in other areas. So does this spread into other areas of not elite society, but also the arts, etc.? Do we see similar pro-gay movements in K-pop, for example, in TV, in media, in movies, or was this a kind of isolated incident?
Recently, there has been more positive portrayals of LGBT, well, particularly lesbians and gays. I don't want to speak too broadly. Transgenders, not really, but lesbians and gays have been more positively portrayed in some Korean dramas, such as Life is Beautiful, and Korean movies such as The Handmaiden. And in K-pop, we're starting to see a bit of a dam breaking in terms of K-pop artists expressing positive views or positive support for LGBTQ. BTS gave a speech, it was a couple of years ago, I think, before the United Nations, expressing support for this. We have Holland, the out gay K-pop singer. So we're seeing that, but it's still quite limited. Certainly, if you want to compare it to what you see in the West, because there can be a price to be paid in this country for a celebrity to come out like that. Even if there's no incidents that I'm aware of right now where there's been a boycott or some major rallying opposition to celebrities making these statements, nonetheless, the fear is going to be there that given the very strong feelings that exist in some quarters of South Korea opposed to LGBTQ rights, if you come out in support of it, it's going to damage your career. So yes, there's been movement, but it's been halting, quite limited, and not as fulsome as certainly we see in the West.
And of course, another aspect of this is the political landscape as we build up this, I suppose, this human rights aspect here. And for many people that are not familiar with South Korean politics, it is left and right, but it's not left and right in the sense that many Western countries are. And as you look inward at South Korean politics, there is no, as far as I'm aware, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there is no party out there that is actually pro-LGBTQ rights. And of course, in power right now is Moon Jae-in, who is ostensibly a left-leaning politician, and he is openly against gay rights.
That's correct. Ironically so. A human rights lawyer and leader of Korea's major leftist party. The Justice Party in Korea, a small party, has come out and its presidential candidate in the last presidential election came out in favor of increased rights for lesbians and gays. I would say, regarding your initial point about left and right not being as familiar or as similar to what we see in the West, I would say it's much like on these social issues that we're discussing, liberal and conservative parties were in the United States, let's say, in the 1950s or 60s. That is, they are liberal on issues like social welfare, and they're liberal in promoting protections and rights for more traditional victim groups like women or immigrants. But the more, if I can say, nouveau categories of victims like LGBTQ, they haven't caught up with that. And that was much as it was in the United States throughout the civil rights era of the mid 20th century up until the late 20th century. You may know that Barack Obama did not come out in favor of same-sex marriage until after he was reelected in his second term. And so it's been slow going there to some extent too. And so Korea is maybe about 20 or so years behind that in terms of its leftist vision of minority rights.
And I feel like we've been painting the picture here, but I don't think we've touched on as much we should, the everyday discrimination that is on the ground here. Despite the rulings of the Human Rights Commission and the idea that there is a certain amount of indifference and the lack of acceptance also comes with a belief that it doesn't exist inside South Korea, so it kind of pushed out of many people's minds. There is also a huge amount of everyday discrimination that happens, so workplace discrimination and schoolyard discrimination are two of the aspects that you document here, and they are quite prevalent.
Right. Of course, because this is still a society with conservative, strong elements of conservative attitudes, many people simply don't come out in public or in the workplace, so they try to escape discrimination that way. But there was a 2014 National Human Rights Commission survey which found almost half of sexual minorities reporting discrimination, exclusion, or sexual harassment, and I would guess that number would be much higher if more people felt free to come out. And yes, there have been reports, significant reports of discrimination and bullying in middle school campuses. Yes, that's a real factor that LGBTQ have to deal with every day in this country, because they have no legal recourse.
And you've mentioned a couple of times some of the changes, at least not legally binding changes, but some of the changes that have happened. Certain mayors around the country have put in anti-discrimination legislation, not binding, of course, and of course the rise of LGBTQ festivals across South Korea as well. And this brings us towards, I suppose, the real crux of this, and this will open this up for many of the listeners out there. The opposition that tends to come down and influence mayors to backtrack, to never put forward this sort of legislation, or to put legal limits on these street protests, these street parades and these booths, etc., or just to come out publicly and have counter protests against these parades. And that is the evangelical community inside South Korea.
Right. This is one thing that, from a political science perspective, political sociology perspective, makes this country so interesting, because in East Asia, and by that I mean Northeast Asia, the presence of this large evangelical Christian population is unique. And so it's a very sui generis factor in studying Korea, Korea's evolution in LGBTQ acceptance and rights. They only occupy about 18% of the population, but are extremely active, organized, vocal, and influential. As groups that are active, vocal, often are. They have come to view the increase in LGBTQ rights, and particularly same-sex marriage, as a threat to Korea's security, Korea's population growth, Korea's salvation, Christian identity, and so that energizes them quite a bit. It's not just this issue. For them, it's linked to other issues. Korea's Confucian traditions are in jeopardy as well. So there's several issues that they bring together to fuel, energize their opposition to LGBTQ rights. And what is also interesting is that their energy is disproportionate to the progress that the LGBT community has actually been able to make in Korea, because, as you pointed out, there's very little political support, very little media support, and yet we see this very strong, aggressive opposition. And so in our research, we have explained that in part by the links which evangelicals in this country have to evangelicals in the United States, and seeing the United States as kind of this model for both the success of Christian evangelicalism, but also the dangers to Christian evangelicalism. So evangelicals in Korea look at the United States and they see same-sex marriage now being legal across the country. They see the advances of LGBTQ rights, And so they're acting in a way almost to preempt that from happening in Korea.
So let's touch on that issue, because that is quite a fascinating one. The idea that South Korean evangelicals are looking towards Western countries, America, quite often, and using this as their outrage meter rather than what's actually happening inside South Korea. And you've written a fascinating article in this itself, and this idea that it's not just that they get outraged, but they develop a politics of victimhood from this. The idea that this is coming to get them, and these are restrictions on religious freedom in the West that South Koreans will someday suffer themselves if they let these rights continue.
Absolutely, the concept of victimhood. That's well put. For example, the Colorado baker, the Masterpiece Cake Shop, Jack Phillips, who refused to bake a cake for a same-sex marriage ceremony. And he was prosecuted by the state of Colorado for violating their state law prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation. His response was, my religion tells me that same-sex marriage is a sin. I'm happy to sell cakes, pre-made cakes, to this couple, but I should not be forced to use my artistry to make a cake for something I consider to be a sinful activity. So it was a conflict between his religious rights and their rights as a same-sex couple to get married, which is legal. And the Colorado Civil Rights Commission penalized Jack Phillips and required him to go through several hours of education. I think evangelical Christians would consider it indoctrination to become more accepting of same-sex marriage. Now, he appealed that to the U.S. Supreme Court, which overturned the Colorado decision, but on procedural grounds, not on substantive grounds. But that's an example. And there have been other examples in the U.S. Florists selling flowers to same-sex marriage ceremonies. And so Koreans, evangelicals, they read about these because these stories are published in their literature, right? They're published in U.S. evangelical literature, and they're editorialized as a discrimination against people of faith. And those articles are either translated into Korean in the Korean publications, or Koreans may write about them in their publications. So it's kind of a victimhood by osmosis in some ways.
Yes, and that victimhood inside South Korea is an incredibly motivating factor, as you mentioned before.
Yes.
Here. But it's not just motivating; it also has it's such a galvanizing aspect for corporations. So you mentioned the idea that it's not just these evangelical groups, but it's also Buddhists and Confucian groups all coming together here.
Yes.
But they're not just outraged and having sporadic protests. They are forming action committees. They're incredibly organized. And you mentioned a few groups and groups names such as the Emergency Task Committee Against Deceptive Human Rights Policies and Poisonous Clauses of the National Action Plan. And these groups are quite widespread groups like this. And a whole huge number of these religious organizations all come together, and they are incredibly organized across the country.
Yes, that group needs a shorter name, by the way.
Yes.
It needs a catchier name.
Absolutely.
You're right. And this is a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, again, it's in part not because of significant progress by LGBTQ in Korea, though there has been some in terms of activism and expression and visibility, as we discussed. But a lot of it comes from the fairly rapid sea change that's gone on in the United States, with political parties becoming and politicians becoming supporters of LGBTQ rights. I mentioned Barack Obama. Bill Clinton also was, during his time, he came up with the famous "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" rule for the military. He was not 100% behind lesbians and gays in the military, but this has changed dramatically in the U.S. in a relatively short period of time, along with legal changes. And so a lot of it is that. A lot of it is seeing that dramatic, sudden, almost shocking change in the U.S. particularly. Not so much Western Europe, right? Because Western Europe is not viewed by Korean evangelicals as particularly religious, right? But the United States is. And so it's that shock recently that has pushed them towards the type of organizations that you are describing. This is fairly recent for them. They've been organized from their churches, right, to come out and protest. But now they're moving in the direction of think tanks and conferences and more structured type of opposition. And so it's likely to play a very important role in future elections.
Do you sense that changing at all? I mean, you've written two very interesting articles here, and one, of course, outlines the four congregations. These are soul-based congregations where the pastors in the congregation are pro-gay rights. The idea of gay Christians, as a quote here, is something that's totally natural and something that is accepted within the churches themselves. And I wonder how you see this, because you've also written another article that shows the differences between the communities, these LGBTQ communities in Seoul and in the rest of Korea. Seoul is much more vibrant. They're almost 20 years ahead of other communities in terms of their how visible they are. So do you just see that this idea that Seoul may be more further ahead of these other communities, or is it just simply that there's, I suppose, a more sporadic change happening there, and Seoul is just a larger community?
Well, it's some of both. Of course, Korea is very soul-centric, as you know, across the board. So it's not unusual that the activism for LGBTQ would be much larger and more vibrant and well-funded than we find in Busan. My comparison was with Busan, which is Korea's second largest city, a very large city, as you know, several million people. And so we wouldn't expect it to be that far behind Seoul. So while, of course, naturally there's going to be some differences, what we found was that the activism, the organization, and the visibility in Busan was much more nascent than you would expect. Given the size differential and also the geographical proximity. It's not like, these cities are not that far apart, but nonetheless, this difference in the development of the communities is patent. And also we found that there was not as much connectivity as one might expect between the Seoul and Busan communities in regard to financial support, administrative support, activist support. It's been growing. It's better than it was before from the activist perspective, but not as much as at least I would have expected, again, given the proximity and the desire for, one would think, the desire for the community in Seoul to create a larger grassroots support network. So yes, that's true. And as far as the churches go that you mentioned, we looked at 4 churches, 2 of which are we could describe them as pro-LGBTQ. They are very not only accepting, but they are enthusiastically supporting the community and its rights. But those are very small churches, and one of them more or less imploded during our period of study. That is, they just fell apart. Which is not surprising, given the small size of those 2 churches. 2 others that we looked at are large evangelical congregations. They are accepting in the sense that they do not pillory, they do not embarrass, they do not castigate openly LGBTQ who want to come and be part of the congregation, join prayer groups, and openly express their sexual and gender identity. But at the same time, even the accepting clergy in those churches continue to view homosexuality, etc., as a sin. So it's a more open than you would find in the more predominant conservative congregations, but not as open as and accepting as the community would like.
That's a very interesting little picture there. And of course, an aspect of this, which you mentioned earlier on, which is often missed and doesn't seem to have the same scope inside South Korea, is the issue of transgender rights.
Right.
Now, this runs a gambit of legal rulings across the years here, starting in a Supreme Court ruling in 2006 that declared transgenders may declare their gender identity, but then plastered a whole range of extremely onerous regulations on on benchmarks that have to hit to actually do this. And yet over the years, there's been a few rulings in certain district courts that have pegged this back. So what is the landscape for transgender rights, and what is the legal status for transgenders in South Korea?
Right. And this, let me preface that by saying I've been loosely using LGBTQ in describing things, but as you rightly point out, more traditional lesbians and gays are I would say more accepted, more accommodated in Korean society than transgenders in terms of the society. So I don't want to be too non-specific in my description. Transgenders have not received the same level of openness and acceptance in society as we find with lesbians and gays. But interestingly, somewhat paradoxically, they have made more progress in the courts. And the Supreme Court ruling you mentioned initially said that people who change their sex can actually, who physically change their sex, can actually change their sexual registration in the Korean Family Register, which, as you know, is a significant thing. It's not a minor thing in Korea. And that was a major legal victory for transgenders. But there were several conditions, including things as limiting as getting your parents' consent for the sexual change. But lower courts in Korea, a few lower courts have eliminated those restrictions in their cases, and even gone so far as to say that this sexual registration can be changed if there has not been actual surgery. That is, pre-surgical or non-surgical transgenders who simply identify as another sex can register. That's quite a liberalization in that area.
And a very interesting aspect of some of those court rulings that you list here is the idea that it hinged on and took advice from previous court rulings in other countries. You've got one from Germany, Britain, Sweden, Finland, America here, and they use these rulings as basis for their own understanding, which brings about a very interesting question. Then we touched on a little bit previously this idea before that evangelicals are again outraged by changes in other countries, and that is the idea that in the LGBTQ rights movement inside South Korea, there seems to be a significant amount of foreign influence. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean in the sense that all the embassies get involved, and a lot of foreigners will march in as part of solidarity. And I wonder how you see that movement, whether you think it's an important part of this and has an extreme benefit, which it may seem to do, or whether you see it as a sense that it may simply come across as foreigners imposing foreign ideas.
Well, both are true, so let me first touch on the court's reference to laws in the United States and Western Europe and World Health Organization standards when they ruled that non-surgical or pre-surgical transgenders could change their gender identity officially. That's a big deal, I think. I'm also a lawyer, as you may know, and I think from a legal perspective, that's a big deal because what it opens the door to is Korean courts going outside of traditional Korean values and court rulings and public surveys to interpret the Korean Constitution or otherwise evolve Korean law to be consistent with what the courts come to view as the international standard in these areas. And so if Korean courts become more and more willing to break out of this, kind of confine of Korean history and Korean court decisions, that could be a real game changer in terms of legal rights in this country. And when you see a country like the United States, which again, in so many ways, for good or ill, is a role model for Koreans ruling that under the U.S. Constitution, same-sex marriage is a constitutional right. You have Taiwan Supreme Constitutional Court ruling that it's a constitutional right. If Korean courts begin to be willing to accept these outside authorities as guideposts, that could, as I say, lead to some rather sudden, quick changes in Korean law. That's a possibility. Now, your other point had to do with just the general foreign influence at, let's say, the grassroots level. That was more true earlier on in LGBTQ activism in Korea. And I think it was useful. I think foreigners provided enthusiasm. They provide a kind of educational experience in terms of their familiarity with these battles in the West. So in that sense, I think it was healthy for Koreans to have that influence. More recently, it's become much more of a Korean movement, and the activists that we interviewed in Busan wanted it to be more of a Korean movement, wanted it to be seen as an indigenous Korean movement. And also I spoke with an individual from New Zealand in Busan who had originally organized the first drag prom in Busan. Again, this sort of early first mover being a foreigner, but she consciously was turning it over to Koreans because she wanted it to have a Korean identity. And I think that's, while I think the foreign influence was beneficial in the beginning, I think now it's important that it have a Korean face and a Korean identity, both because it's such an easy criticism for opponents to say, well, this is just foreigner influence. And so if you're supportive of these rights, you want to eliminate that. But also because groups that are suffering the discrimination should take ownership of that situation and be the leaders in opposing it.
From that, let's push on to an issue that you mentioned earlier at the start of the podcast, and that's the issue of military, the South Korean military, and the internal regulations against LGBTQ rights inside the military. And these seem to be specific towards homosexual acts, because it is there are women in the military, but all males are conscripted by law to the military, and it has some bad echoes of as you mentioned before, Bill Clinton's "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" here, as in. It's not necessarily, if I'm wrong here, it's not necessarily you're not restricted by being gay in the military, but any gay act, as in you become openly gay, and particularly gay sex, for example, then there's a whole range of legal restrictions that come your way, and of course these are quite onerous. These are charges of imprisonment and dishonorable discharge, etc.
That's correct. The Article 92.6 of the military code prohibits anal intercourse and other indecent acts. So the anal intercourse would be more specific to gay sex, male on male sex, but the other indecent act, I mean, could be interpreted to include other types of non-heterosexual sex. But so far, it's been focused on gays, as you mentioned, male on male sex. And the punishment is significant. Imprisonment with labor up to 2 years. There have been almost 200 prosecutions under this law. And according to our records from 2004 to 2007, that's the period we looked at, with 3 soldiers convicted. Most recently in 2017, there was another conviction, an Army captain sentenced to 6 months in prison. So, and of course, as you say, dishonorable discharge. So it's quite draconian. This has been challenged repeatedly with the Constitutional Court, which has repeatedly upheld it as a legitimate regulation for the purpose of military discipline and morale.
And there's another element there, which is, I suppose, a slightly unique to the South Korean situation, which comes up in that particular ruling that you mentioned there, that court ruling. And that is the idea that it says here, given our national security situation, and that is the idea that conscription is absolutely necessary because of the risks abroad. And then they also blanket under that the idea that you cannot have any sort of, you have to have a certain, the quote is, healthy and disciplined military society as part of that. So it seems as though the courts and this law is using the national security situation as a kind of emergency protection against change.
That's the rationale, and I'm not here to be an advocate for one side or the other, but to be to discuss my research as a social scientist. But I will ask you, can you think of another country in the world that is has as vulnerable, or perhaps more vulnerable, a security situation as South Korea? I have one in mind. Can you think of it?
There are countries out there that, off the top of my head, I don't know if as vulnerable.
How about Israel?
Okay. Yes. Absolutely.
And
yes.
Israel allows LGBTQ to openly serve in their military. So it's questionable how much of that is a thoughtful and accurate concern for allowing this kind of discrimination and this kind of punishment. But yes, that is the argument that's made by the court. One of the arguments that's made, but there's also just this general argument that the military should be able to maintain a certain level of morale and discipline, and the only way to effectively do this, or an important element in effectively doing this, is limiting this sexual activity. But as you point out, homosexual identity itself is not illegal. Much as we've discussed before is the case in the general society. Yeah.
And there's another element here that you mentioned in your research, and this is one of those really interesting parts of South Korean society. As you mentioned, the evangelical community here is such a rare and I suppose unique kind of parochial aspect of South Korea. But there's also these Christian private universities. Yes. And this has become, through your research here, a lot of research here, in many ways, the new battleground for this, the idea that certain students trying to express certain rights, whether it's through art or simply self-expression, and the universities trying to restrict this, expelling them, or through other mechanisms, and the courts, these battles being fought out in the courts.
Yes. 3 universities we looked at, Hongdong Global University, Christian Sung-Sil University, and Presbyterian University and Theological Seminary, all private Christian universities, have all had recent incidences within the last 3 years of students either holding events, inviting speakers, showing documentaries on the Kim's same-sex marriage that we discussed earlier and inviting Director Kim to come and speak, or as self-expression, appearing at a chapel service wearing the rainbow colors of the LGBTQ movement in the West on the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, photographing themselves at the chapel service like that, and then posting it on social media. And in each of these cases, the students have been penalized in various ways, censured, suspended, and in two cases, in the Handong case and the Presbyterian University and Theological Seminary case, the students brought a claim in district courts, and they were successful. They were successful in getting their discipline, those who brought the suit, getting their discipline overturned. And that's quite important too, I would say, for the progress of LGBTQ rights in Korea, that their rights of expression and their right to diversify, we can say, the campus with their views is trumping the university's claim that it has an absolute right to limit that sort of thing because they're Christian universities.
And there's a very interesting few legal rulings here, and you mentioned them there. But there was also the other one you mentioned, the Sun Sil case. It has a very interesting idea of religious freedom here. So when it came before the Human Rights Commission, the school itself pushes back and says we are a Christian university, and therefore allowed to a Christian school, and therefore allowed to promote Christian values, etc. And the courts, the commission's ruling in response, and I quote here: "The university's founding principle, based on the spirit of Christianity, cannot be forced into realization nor achieved through coercion or restriction." And this is one of those ideas that comes out here, that is that you a single institution inside South Korea has the right to advocate whatever values it likes, but it cannot impose those values on the people inside its organizations. Was that your reading from these particular rulings?
Well, yes, that is correct. But I would say even more than that, what the Human Rights Commission is saying is that normatively they shouldn't be trying to do it that way, and this raises the question of, how should LGBTQ proceed in trying to advance their rights? And for that matter, how should opponents proceed in getting their concerns recognized? What the Human Rights Commission was saying there, and in rulings in these other cases, is that dialogue is important, that forcing viewpoints on the other side is not constructive. So as a legal matter, yes, they should not do it. But as a normative matter, it also is not the healthiest way for a society, a liberal democratic society, which is so divided on this issue, to find common ground and to work out their differences.
So you mentioned there the idea of what the pathway forward should be for both sides of this debate. And as we begin to wind this up, this is a very interesting way to pull a lot of the strands we have here together. And one of the articles that you've written here has a very interesting thread running through it. And that's the idea that identity politics can be something that we cling to. The idea that, especially an oppressed identity and an oppressed minority, it's quite natural to move into this space of identity politics and to form around that. But you put forward an idea that perhaps it's better to bring forward a bridge in dialogue, and that's a quote here. And that's the idea that instead of simply galvanizing around that singular identity, you should spread out as much as possible and bring in other groups inside the Korean society. And this perhaps is a much, I'm not sure what the right word is, a much easier way to move forward without as much resistance that might be out there inside people's minds.
Yes, well, this is a meta narrative in my work with Joseph Yee and our articles, and it reflects our normative values on how liberal democracies should, in large part, go about resolving these sorts of differences. We certainly recognize the important role that legal protections play, but those legal protections are likely to be easier to achieve and more commonly enforced and supported if a consensus can be reached by proponents, among proponents and opponents. And so what we would like to see is both sides creating bridges with each other. And the article you mentioned talked about how it's often easier to create those bridges in non-political settings. That is, instead of trying to do it, let's say, within a political party, where it might politics would be at the forefront and it might be quite divisive. If these groups come together, members of these groups, not as groups, but just as members, come together in places like places of religious worship, or community organizations, garden clubs, language clubs, whatever. And they develop personal relationships, get to know each other, understand each other better. Well, there's a fair amount of sociological study that shows that kind of bridging, that kind of personal connection in non-political settings reduces this sense of in-group, out-group kind of barrier, and people fear each other less. And as a result, they become more accommodating, more willing to compromise.
So as a personal question then, on that same kind of issue there, how do you view the American Supreme Court rule in 2015 that legalized gay marriage? So, and this is a question for South Korea as well, because one of the quick questions that run through your research here is the next battleground for this. Is it going to be the Korean constitution, so to speak? So, how do you see that? Is it useful, or is it just going to get people's backs up and people's battle cries running here? Do you think that a ruling from a Supreme Court like that is a good thing, or is it just too impositional and you really want to change ideas and build these things up from the ground?
My answer is I'm not sure. It's a difficult question. That I struggle with. I of course recognize, particularly given American history and from the United States, the importance that court rulings played in the African American civil rights movement of the 1950s. Brown versus Board of Education, the court ruling that ordered desegregation of schools. These rulings are very important in setting new normative standards of behavior. They're important in galvanizing groups, giving them encouragement that they can win, they can achieve their civil rights goals. They often give politicians cover, right? Politicians who otherwise are afraid to come out in favor of a particular civil rights position. If the court says this is the way the Constitution should be interpreted, politicians say, well, what can I say? That's what the court ordered, and we have to carry out the order of the court. So there's a lot of positivism, and there's just the creation of legal rights, allowing people then to sue and get protection. On the other hand, as the article you referenced discussed, we point out that the abortion decision in the United States, Roe versus Wade, or the woman's right to choose decision, Roe versus Wade in 1973, did the opposite in the U.S. Instead of moving the right to an abortion forward, instead of increasing it, which it was actually doing in the U.S. at that time. I mean, more politicians were coming out supporting it. It was not the contentious issue it became after Roe v. Wade. But after Roe v. Wade, we saw this galvanized opposition, very strong and powerful opposition rise up. And to this day, some 36 years later, am I getting my math right? Is it
It's about right. Yeah, it's
40,
about right.
46 years later, it still remains a cleavage issue in the United States. And you read about it whenever a Supreme Court justice is nominated in the United States. That's a major issue, their position on Roe v. Wade. So instead of actually creating more compromise and consensus, it created a tremendous divisiveness, and I would say in some respects the right to abortion has been significantly undermined as a result. So it's hard to say. It's hard to give just a simple answer to your question. A lot of it depends on the country we're talking about, and we're talking about Korea. So it would depend on where society is. You don't necessarily have to wait until society has completely accepted the right. Then there's really no point for the court to reach that decision. It's superfluous at that point. But at the same time, if it hasn't had enough time to sort of bubble up through society and through the political system and be debated, then you might get a situation like you did with Roe v. Wade. Now, I have to say, in the article we wrote, which you referenced, which we wrote in 2017, we speculated, we weren't sure, but we speculated the Obergefell decision, that's the U.S. Supreme Court decision, might trigger the same kind of reaction as did with Roe v. Wade, but it has not. So I would say that that's perhaps a model for Korea, that there had been enough debate in the U.S., there had been enough movement in the polls, public movement, enough politicians. There had been enough changes in other areas of society, like the military, even though Don't Ask, Don't Tell was not a complete victory for LGBTQ. It was somewhat of a victory. That when the Supreme Court issued its ruling, it certainly advanced rights significantly, but it did not trigger the backlash we saw with abortion.
So I'm going to ask a final question here, and of course this is going to be just as tricky to answer as the previous one. And for a good political scientist like yourself, you're not going to want to speculate much. But how do you see the future of this playing out in South Korea? I know this is one of those things that you've touched on a lot in your just previous answer there, but I suppose perhaps more importantly, how do you see? Do you sense anything in the wind? You've done a lot of empirical research here. You've lived in the country for a number of years. You've been in the issue for a while. Do you sense anything coming about in the wind, or do you simply, or are you seeing any new battle lines out there that are going to be drawn in the next few years? How do you sense things are going to go in South Korea in the next brief period?
Well, depends on how brief we're talking about. I will say, I'll give myself a little time. I will say within the next 10 years, you will see some dramatic changes. It may not be same-sex marriage. It may be civil unions, which again was a stepping stone in the U.S. too. There were several states that had legalized civil unions between same-sex couples, not officially calling it marriage. It may be civil unions, but I think something like either civil unions or same-sex marriage will be achieved. I think that you will see a anti-discrimination bill at the national level. And my reasons for this are that one is the generational change that we mentioned before. Time is on the side of those who promote these rights because generationally the polling shows that there's greater support at younger ages. We've seen rulings with the Korean courts, which are indicative of a trend toward a greater respect for individual freedoms. We haven't discussed a very important recent ruling by the Supreme Court. It's somewhat off topic, but also related, and that is that conscientious objectors can now be excused from military service in Korea. That was a major change that previously had been rejected repeatedly. And so we're seeing a liberalization. We've discussed a lot of that at the lower court level and somewhat at the higher court level. And we're seeing the increased activism. And I also believe that Korea as a society likes to think of itself, and this is, and I think this is a wholesome thing, likes to think of itself as a liberal democracy on the same level as liberal democracies in the West. And increasingly, LGBTQ rights have become a marker for being an advanced liberal democratic state. And so I think those factors, among some others, are going to have a snowball effect. It can change rapidly. It changed rapidly in Taiwan. It changed rapidly in the United States. And I'm not just talking about the court decisions. I mean, there have been rapid shifts in political support and in surveys. So I can see that same kind of dam breaking in Korea within the next 10 years.
So that is a great hopeful note to end the podcast on here. The research that I did for this podcast is from a number of Joe's articles. Now, I'm going to link as many below as possible this podcast. I do encourage listeners to go and read them for themselves. There's a huge number of this on this topic as well. Human rights, I'm going to link as much as possible. Go in there, read it for yourself. On that, Joe Phillips, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
I enjoyed it very much.